All right, everyone. I think, let me check and see. I think we're up and running. My name is Dennis Misigoy, Libertarian, running for the U.S. Senate here in the state of Florida. A little late, but still trying to make sure I make time and be on here a little bit on Thursday. This is kind of the day I've set up to go ahead and do these live streams. So I hope that you guys still find some time to tune in and listen. If not now, certainly sometime later would still be good if you have some time to listen. But I love having people on live because that makes it a little easier to have some meaningful interaction as folks can chime in and throw some stuff. Earlier this week, had a chance to go back down to Miami. We had a little meet and greet event in Coral Gables, so that was great. A nice little turnout and good conversation, more than anything else, talking about why we really have the need for this and kind of what's the path that I kind of envision for this campaign and really what is the goal, what is the change we want to see, and what is the change that we need. I'm fond of putting at the end of a lot of messages and on as much stuff as I can the fact that change cannot wait, and why that is demonstrated by a whole lot of things. Certainly the policies that we've got going on. We'll go with some of the marquee items because I don't know if I want to say a laugh, but it was a little bit of back and forth I saw earlier or yesterday, I think it was initially on social media, with another person from I would always call the foreign policy establishment. This one from the U.S. Congress, Representative Dan Crenshaw from Texas. Is essentially saying out loud the same thing that Hillary Clinton was advocating right at the beginning of the Russian invasion into Ukraine about how great it was because it was going to allow us to basically repeat the strategy that we employed in Afghanistan against the USSR back in the 1980s, which is quite remarkable and I think illustrative of the fact that the people that have been elected into power from both parties in the past and in the present. So the present, we haven't gotten away from this yet. The people that are there still think that this is a great idea. And you can judge for yourself whether you think they have other ulterior motives, because certainly it's not bad for the military-industrial complex to have wars going, whether near or far, and to have weapons being purchased to be used. So that's certainly good, and you can certainly also tie in the ulterior motives. But even if you just take them at face value, even if you believe that these folks are all telling you the truth, what they're telling you is pretty disturbing, because what they're telling you in these moments is that our goal here really isn't about saving Ukraine. It's certainly not saving democracy. It's not protecting the world. Russia's not going to take over the world with an economy the size or smaller than the state of New York or Italy. They're not, even with the leftover nuclear arsenal of the Soviet Union, which makes them something to avoid war with. Certainly, we don't want to go full on and launch an open war with a nuclear armed power. Certainly not that one, or any. But the idea that this is a sort of a prelude to anything big it's complete nonsense. What is going on here? And again, you hear a couple of these people really sort of delightfully cheer it on in this case, where it was a tweet and basically saying, yeah, how great, we get to, let me go find the words for it. I don't want to paraphrase here. Because investing in the destruction of our adversary's military without losing a single American troop strikes me as a good idea. You should feel the same. This is a reply to somebody else who was pointing out the fact that the U.S. just spent another $40 billion, sent another $40 billion over to Ukraine. And it's funny, the folks who who go after Elon Musk. Somebody else pointed this out. All the folks who go after Elon Musk about spending $40 billion or a little bit over $40 billion on purchasing Twitter. None of them are going to come out of the woodwork to go and say, hey, U.S. government, why not, instead of trying to prolong this war between Russia and Ukraine, instead of trying to prolong that and just make this thing go on further, why don't you spend that $40 billion to end world hunger? Nobody's going to come back and say that, but that's a sort of interesting side note. But the fact that he's basically openly saying the same thing that Hillary Clinton said early on a few months back when this whole conflict began, which is that, yeah, our strategy is we should just do the same thing we did with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, fund these rebels and this resistance and whatever, and it'll hurt our enemies. In this case, I'm not sure really needs to be our enemy. Others can debate some of that and sort of the merits. That's not to say that Putin's a good guy or the good guy in any of this. I think it's obviously still wrong to invade any other country, and that's really the ultimate step when it goes into starting a war. And it's something I don't want us to do, and it's something I don't want any other country to do. So it's not a defense of that, but it's simply a recognition of the U.S.'s role in a lot of this, which is not, which has certainly been to support and help prop up a lot of political elements within Ukraine that are very anti-Russia sentiment, that are very antagonistic towards Russia. And at the same time, we're also arming them, we're moving weapons in there. There's the specter of the whole biolabs, which is its own conversation. But, we've got all these things going on, and we're sending money and weapons. We've been giving intelligence to help out their military efforts, which allegedly has aided in also the sinking of some Russian ships. So it's not like the U.S. isn't involved. It would be one thing if we could say the U.S. was not involved and wouldn't be involved. And that would be a more, I think, defensible position. But that's clearly not what's happening. The U.S. is using Ukraine, unfortunately, in a very negative way, and in a way that's probably likely to have some bad consequences. May not be the same, but it may be similar to what we had with Afghanistan. Anybody who remembers that and kind of what came after knows that this was basically the genesis of the threat. This was the genesis of the enemy who committed the largest terrorist attack in the history, certainly of this country, but perhaps the world. I'm trying to think. I don't have a good encyclopedia type of memory on that subject per se, but certainly the largest in U.S. history, largest terrorist attack, that being September 11th, 2001, was committed by folks whose kind of origin story really went through the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet Union. We know that there's some extremist elements within Ukraine, certainly different sort of extremist elements, but that's part of the mix, and it's something that we really need to be mindful of and think about. But also, even just for the sake of, even if that was off the table, even if that was zero chance of something like that coming out of it, just from a moral perspective of what are we doing to the Ukrainians if we're arming them, or we're doing this and that, we're sort of pushing for this war to happen, to kind of use them as cannon fodder to weaken the Russians. Meanwhile, making no effort to really stop the war, I think is I don't think this has changed, but it's been for a little while that I've been aware that Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has not had a single conversation with his Russian counterpart, the Foreign Minister Lavrov, I believe. Zero conversations, and you wonder, it's very deliberate on one side when you start to think about it. It's not that we're willing to do anything we can to help these people out and save them, so we're going to spend all this money, we're going to give them these weapons, we're going to give them intel and this and that, because we're so desperate to help them. If we were so desperate to help them in any way possible, one of those ways would be trying to approach a diplomatic solution, because that's the only kind that actually stops the war. That's the only kind that actually stops killing, that doesn't require more and more of it in order to achieve whatever desired result, but desired by who, I think, is a good question. And in opposition to U.S. involvement in war, abroad, and certainly not something we would like to see here, is one of the defining values of us as libertarians. And so, with that little segue, I do want to also mention, I think for the first time over here, at least for me, a couple of the LP affiliates here in the state, I think, have started already posting stuff. But we're going to have an anti-war rally over here in Central Florida in St. Cloud, Veterans Park, coming up June 4th. I was putting this stuff together last week or two, trying to figure it out, find the right place and everything else. So we're hoping to start promoting that out there. I'm going to get that up on my website and social media as well, so that folks know the information and the date. It's going to be 11 in the morning on June 4th. We're going to get together for a pro-peace, anti-war rally. And, this is a message, and I think one of the things that's most important, it's got to be the number one priority. I'm not the first person to say it, but the number one priority of U.S. foreign policy at this time really, really needs to be avoiding open nuclear war, or I should say open war with a nuclear power. There's no good that's going to come out of that. And it's one of these things where it should be easy enough to avoid. It's not good for them. It's not good for us. Who's really winning? And I think this is one of those situations where it's likely to be, if God forbid we were to end up in that kind of situation, it wouldn't be the result of anyone who consciously wanted it. It would probably end up being the result of the incompetence of the foreign policy establishment. I made this point when I was speaking to folks Tuesday night, and I make this point often lately, is that the foreign policy establishment we have in this country, including folks like Senator Rubio, who they have pretty much lied about the motives, the motivations behind every foreign intervention for the last at least 20 years, 20, 30 years. They've lied about the intentions, the goals behind it, and they have been wrong. This is probably more important. They've been wrong about the consequences, about the effects of any one of these interventions every single time. When they decided to shift gears from, instead of going after Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and all these guys, when they decided to, instead of doing that they were instead going to go after the Taliban and they were going to do regime change in Afghanistan. Whatever ulterior motives and whatever, negative things we can ascribe to them, I don't think that they believed that the government that they were going to pour all these trillions into creating, and that they were going to spend 20 years on, I don't think they envisioned that it would be so paper thin that it would collapse within a week of the U.S. withdrawal. Now, to be fair, I don't think they ever intended for the U.S. to withdraw either. I think they intended that to be, another forever occupation. But I don't think they envisioned the Taliban surviving and the Taliban ultimately taking over back again in 20 years. I don't think that ever crossed their mind. Likewise in Iraq. The guys who thought it was a great idea to go after Saddam Hussein in an era of when we were supposedly going after fundamentalist extremists, we decided to go after a guy who was really more of a secular Western style dictator. We targeted him, Saddam Hussein, and I think the people who pushed that idea along also didn't really understand or didn't predict quite right that instead of getting Ahmed Chalabi and whatever his little group of people or whoever else in charge, that we were going to end up with a Shiite-led government friendly to Iran, and that's what we got. I don't think they predicted when they started messing around in Syria and helping out, Jabhat al-Nusra and these kind of guys. I don't think they anticipated they were going to get ISIS. And so it's that sort of thinking, that's recognition that these folks have done such a poor job at predicting the consequences of their actions that really gives me pause and concern about what's going on, because these guys might think they really could thread that needle, that they could just do enough to harm Russia, to cause trouble, and get away with it. And it's not that yeah, I don't trust those guys to be able to actually pull that off. The consequences of getting it wrong in this case are just too high. Um, it's too big. This isn't getting it wrong against Saddam or Muqtada al-Sadr. It's different when we talk about getting it wrong against Vladimir Putin and Russia with again, the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal and probably more nuclear weapons beyond that that they've developed since then, because they were, again, sort of the heirs to that technology and legacy. So other people can talk more about the capabilities. I've heard some interesting things, but I'll stay away from that part of it because it's not really at the core of the issue. Because even if we blow up some of them before they blow up some of us, it's going to be everybody if it happens. And, that should be everyone's greatest fear, and it should be the number one objective of our foreign policy. But instead, it's led by folks like this who are more interested in trying to repeat the mistakes of the past for whatever reason. A refusal to learn and a refusal to also consider the cost in terms of human lives of the Ukrainians on the ground. I think this is something I always try to harp on, particularly lately and just in general, as I've, one of the big knocks on libertarians and also on folks who go the non-interventionist route in terms of foreign policy also, is that we don't care, or we're not, we're uncaring, we only care about ourselves, that's why we don't want to get into these things. But I think it's quite the opposite. I think the folks who want to get involved certainly feign a level of concern, but the reality is if someone wants to just arm the Ukrainians to try to bleed the Russians, then you're not trying to save the Ukrainians. You're just using them, as I said, cannon fodder and expendable weapons to kind of serve another nation's purpose, another political entity's purpose that isn't theirs. And I don't think that's compassionate whatsoever. I think compassion is taking a step back and trying to save as many lives while not trying to make use of folks and trying to respect their wishes as much at the individual level as possible. Obviously, this is a more different situation. This is at the level of nations invading one another, but even then, those nations are not unified in that regard. So, but we should always be seeking the non-violent solution, or trying to de-escalate, even if it's somebody else who initiated it, which isn't usually the case in most of the conflicts we've been involved in. But even where it is, even like this, our goal should be to de-escalate, not to try to overpower and show strength and this and that, because that's only going to lead to more of the stuff we want to avoid. And some might say cynically, well, we're going to get more of that if we do back down, or if we do these other things. And there's maybe one example they can point to of that. So still, I think where peace is possible, and I do believe that peace is possible, it should always be our highest goal. And certainly in terms of foreign policy. And I do believe it's achievable. I don't think that what's happening now has to be happening. It doesn't have to be this way. It didn't have to be this way. And the good news that I always want to convey to people is that it doesn't have to stay this way. We don't need to keep the people in power who keep making these decisions. We don't need to continue to follow and listen to the establishment and organizations and the parties that have gotten us to this point. We've got to be willing to finally find the resolve. And this is something that came up as well in some of my conversations earlier this week, was that, how do we get through this? How do we get out of it? To me, it's real simple. Not easy, but very simple. And it just boils down to enough of us having the resolve that we will no longer tolerate this. We've got to open enough eyes and ears so that people hear this message and they start to become aware of these things, and also help people to, because once you see it, once you understand it, once you know it, I find it really just impossible to turn away. You have to, you feel compelled to do something. I certainly do, and I think that And I think that's true of most people. But it really just boils down to enough of us having the resolve to say that no more, we're not going to tolerate that. It's interesting that I was, in another back and forth, actually over here on social media as well, was where a fellow friend of mine brought me up as a candidate, somebody that they would like to support, and other folks responded back talking about the likely Democrat nominee, Val Demings. I'll get a funny thing in there for something she was talking about recently, but bringing her up, and some of this. One of the things I brought up, because it's always one of the easiest things to sort of bring up. I made a little video about it at the beginning of the year, or at the end of last year actually, which was the votes to continue to increase military spending through the most recent NDAA. It's something that Congresswoman Demings has done consistently, and it's one of those things where I think even for folks on the left, they kind of cringe at it. But the question is, how big of a deal is it to them? If you recognize that there's something wrong with it, either it matters to you enough to do something about it, or it doesn't, and that's the question, is do we have the resolve to say, this person is voting for these things and doing this stuff that is so awful, and I'm just not going to tolerate it. I'm not going to support those people. Unfortunately, what happens is people just seem to people have oftentimes compartmentalized and just accepted, particularly when it's their party, when they have this strong identification with their party, that when it's one of the old two parties, and they'll say, well, they're all doing that, and things to that effect, to sort of blunt that recognition of reality of this awful things that people do in terms of really supporting the foreign policy that we have, the funding the foreign policy that we have, and making it possible. So you call that out to people, and they make kind of excuses and want to present. But at the end of the day, it really is a question of whether you have the resolve. And that's what I want to inspire in people, really, is to have the recognition of what's wrong, and to have the resolve to say, we just won't accept it anymore. And whether that is, again, all the foreign wars, the escalation of the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, or violation of Second Amendment rights, like the red flag laws that Senator Rubio has tried to push into the U.S. Senate. It could be other sorts of legislation or ideas or policies, more of the sort of central economic planning pushed by both of them. This idea that it is within the correct role of Washington, D.C. to suck up as much money as they can through taxation from us across the country in the different states, take that money, get their cut, spread it around to all of the unelected, goodness gracious, excuse me, all of the unelected bureaucrats on their staff, spread that money out there, then give us a tiny bit back for something that they think is important, make a big show of it, and then ask us to thank them, tell us how great they are, because they gave us all these federal funds to support this, that, and the other thing locally, which was money that they just took from us in the first place. They took it from us, took their cut, gave us a little bit back, and then they want credit for it. And but that's the standard operating procedure there. So it is what it is. But it doesn't have to be, is the point. So a couple other fun ones. Recent post I saw from her discussing how the folks in the Judiciary Committee arguing about creating a code of ethics for the Supreme Court justices. Now, on the one level is just a question of whether that would make any kind of sense, because the Supreme Court is obviously supposed to be a third co-equal branch of the government with the legislature. So how can the legislature seek to regulate the Supreme Court justices individually in such a way? The Supreme Court justices don't work for Congress. They're not selected by Congress. They're not there to serve Congress. They are meant to be a separate co-equal branch that is actually supposed to serve as a check and balance on the U.S. Congress. So I mean, that's one wrinkle of it, and that's, I think, the more cut and dry sort of thing. But what really struck me about it is just the absurdity of the U.S. Congress creating and enforcing a code of ethics on any other body. I don't know about you, but I've heard many and thought of many words that can describe the U.S. Congress. Ethical has never been among them. Ethical is not a word I would use to describe the U.S. Congress. So the idea that they would be the arbiter of what is ethical behavior for the Supreme Court justices is just, or anyone else really for that matter, it just, what can you really say about it? It ranks right up there in absurdity with this whole disinformation governance board over at the DHS, over at Homeland Security, that the government who lies to us more than anyone else is now going to be the police of information to say what is and is not disinformation and misinformation, to control those lanes of communication in our society. It's worse than comical, because at least there would be some redeeming value to it if there was some humor to it. But it's a bad joke, and it's absurd, and nobody should tolerate that. Let's see. I'll just touch back with a statement that came back. It is funny though with I guess one of the positives for with the abortion debate coming back into the forefront though is the return of rhetoric around bodily autonomy from the Democrat side. Something we were missing for the last couple of years, particularly when folks talk about who should be able to make their own choices about medical care and this and that. Obviously that plays into the whole debate we had throughout the COVID time, and still to a limited degree, but not quite so much, about vaccine mandates and requirements of all that nature, that individuals should get to make their own medical choices and government have no say in it. It is funny also to see a prominent Democrat get pushback from other Democrats when they make a broad statement like that, obviously in reference to this one thing, but it applies when you talk about vaccinations and those sort of things. So it's fun to listen to, but another thing where it also sort of bleeds into, if you're really serious about people having medical freedom, if that's what we want to say, medical freedom to choose across the full spectrum of that sort of thing, one of those things has to come in with self-medication when we talk about drug prohibition. Should any substance be restricted from people being able to have access to it, to produce it, have it, consume it? As a libertarian, obviously, I look at those actions and I say none of those things are actions which, inherently violate another person's individual rights. This is not murder, theft, kidnapping, assault, or anything of the like. These are voluntary actions, and there's no party to those actions that isn't a voluntary participant in it when it happens. And so just on a matter of principle, there should never be laws against it. And if we were serious about medical freedom, that would be a given, because who really knows? It's certainly not the government to say whether something has medicinal qualities or can serve a purpose. And in particular, obviously cannabis is always going to be the most high-profile example. And, if you think about, we have more than half of states have acknowledged by means of legalization at bare minimum for medicinal purposes that there is medicinal value to cannabis, and yet it still remains criminalized at the federal level. What does that tell you? That something that has medicinal value is still criminalized at the federal level. It's not about safety and not about health. and if we're serious about these sort of things, and certainly serious about something like medical freedom, again, these are things we just shouldn't be compromising on. We shouldn't be accepting leaders. That's a really stretch. I shouldn't call them leaders. We shouldn't be allowing or tolerating folks in public office holding political power who are still of the mindset that they have the legitimate power and standing, and that they are correct in prohibiting people from having this, in blocking people's access to cannabis and other substances. It's not within their power. Legitimately, they have no moral standing for it, and no constitutional standing for it either when we talk about the federal government, certainly. It also brings back to my attention the fact that all of the negative consequences to it, even the fact that drugs themselves are made worse, more dangerous, more potent. I think I've probably talked about this in the past a little bit, but something that was anecdotally sort of brought up back to my mind, something I was watching last night that reminded me of this. Think about the example of prohibition in particular. If you think about when alcohol was illegal, you had much more dangerous, potent, diluted sort of, bootlegged alcohol that was much more dangerous for folks on average. By contrast, when alcohol became legal again, what is the tendency of it when something is legal is actually people move away from the more potent and to more mild substances. And a sort of funny example of that was, look, do you think that that the bootleggers and everything back then in the 100 years ago, you think they were selling light beer? It's just an interesting thought that what has actually happened in the time when it's legal is that people come up with diverse alternatives. That's not to say that there aren't more potent alcohols in some areas, but the more that it's openly available, people will choose to moderate because they can moderate more easily, and they don't have to deal with they're not limited by having to purchase in a black market. They're just not constrained in the same way that they are when their particular substance of vice is criminalized. And so I thought it was an interesting observation, but and I wanted to share that with you guys. Thank you guys for joining me. I am at about time, or actually a little bit past, so I'm going to wrap this up. Thank you guys for joining me. I'm going to try to see about announcing some other stuff coming up in the next couple weeks. Stay tuned, and make sure, if you're not already, follow me on all the different social medias, if you're on there. Facebook, Instagram, we got a little bit less of content on there, but still follow there if you're on there, and on Twitter. It's at Dennis Misigoy. On Facebook and Instagram, it's at Elect Misigoy. So hope to talk to you guys again soon. Stay safe, and see you guys next week.
Thank you.